Hi. Today I want to speak about the institution of slave armies. Essentially, how did they get started in the medieval Islamic world? Why were they so successful? And why did rulers ultimately find them to be a particularly useful mechanism for raising an army? Because today we don't use slaves in our military, and we don't have slaves in general. So, what did it mean to have slaves at that time? Um, Now, I'm not going to speak about the entirety of slavery in the medieval Middle East, but slavery in general was a common institution. It was very different from chattel slavery known in the Americas during the 18th and 19th century, of course. But in the end, it comprised of the idea of owning a person. And in fact, we see that specialized elite slave armies became a very common institution in many different Islamic polities. And after this period, after the period we're talking about during the reign of Al-Mutassim, so kind of 833 to 842, we see numerous dynasties raising armies of slaves, and the major source of armies was either nomadic groups or slaves, often taken from nomadic groups on the edges of the Islamic world. So we're going to look at how this all started, at least in the Abbasid Empire. Um, Here we have a caliph named Al-Mu'tasim. He was the brother of Al-Ma'mun. Um, Unlike the civil war in which Al-Ma'mun was fighting with his own brother Al-Amin, Al-Mu'tasim essentially waited and helped Al-Ma'mun in his struggle against his brother. And upon Al-Ma'mun's death, he became the caliph, as it was agreed upon. As you can see, though, he only lived for about 9 years. During that time, as he was essentially a prince in waiting during the reign of Al-Ma'mun, he started to develop his own private army, one recruited out of Central Asian slaves that he first bought in Baghdad in slave markets. People like some of the commanders of this army named Itach and Ashinas, and eventually, through them, started recruiting more and more slaves, about 3 to 4,000 of them. Now, what was the point of this? Why was it necessary to have slaves? And why were they lacking a decent military to begin with? Well, on one hand, the most important thing to keep in mind about a slave army is not as we imagine today, or at least when I ask my students today about what is it about slaves that make them loyal, it's not that slaves are necessarily obsequious and loyal without any independent thought. Today, we think of people who are slaves as people without any will or any capacity to act outside of what their master tells them. But this is not the case at all. The issue with slaves is that they are divorced from local politics. The point is that you want to take people from the margins of whatever world you are on and bring them into your area where they're essentially dependent on the master for their social connections, for their pay, and ultimately for their future once they are manumitted, that is, when they're freed. Now, the other problem is that local armies and local soldiers have commitments, they have allegiances to local groups, and often they're not going to act, at least in the eyes of the ruler, in the best interests of the ruler, or and so forth. And so for a ruler who wants a easily mobilized army that can be quickly deployed and is not going to get too involved in local politics, a slave army is essentially the best option. And in fact, slaves were already used within armies in different places and times in the the late antique Middle East. But this is the first time we have extensive use of slaves, and in which we have even complete armies made out of slaves. And this continues essentially until the 17th century. Now, the Abbasids had a specific problem, more specifically, Al-Ma'mun had a problem in that the large numbers um, of Abbasid soldiers, the so-called Abna, were not necessarily on his side in the civil war he fought against Al-Amin. And in fact, he had very limited supplies of essentially of loyal soldiers when he needed to create military power. He often turned to different military entrepreneurs, like the founders of the so-called Mini Tahir dynasty, and also to his brother Al-Mutassim. Each of these basically created armies outside of the traditional power source of the Abbasids, the so-called Abna, the traditional soldiery from Khorasan, who was now living in Baghdad. In this case, Al-Ma'mun always had a problem in terms of clear military power to convey his will within the empire. And so for Mutassim, seeing this, working with his brother Al-Ma'mun, he began to develop essentially an option for himself, which is an army of Central Asian slaves. Now, why Central Asia? Partially because many of these people were Turks, not always, but some. Turks were at this point not generally Islamized. Some of them were, but at the very least, they weren't Muslims. This made them possible to be enslaved when they were captured in raids or in other attacks. And the nice thing in their mind for these Turks is that they were trained as to how to ride horses and how to fight on horses. So they were considered some of the best people in the world, especially when it came to, for example, shooting an arrow while riding a horse. And so they were essentially a very highly trained group of young men, adolescents essentially, who had specific skills that could then be deployed in clear fashion on the battlefield. These boys they were trained even more heavily, and then they were given full stipends once they became soldiers, full stipends, weapons, horses. They were even given women slaves so they could, from Central Asia, possibly in this idea of trying to recreate an entire group of Central Asian slave people. This didn't happen, by the way, but this was the idea. And then they were kept in Baghdad. Because they were a large group and they basically socialized amongst themselves, they really just continued to speak Turkish and didn't integrate into the population. Now, this created some types of difficulties. One is the connections with the local population was at times testy. So there was often fights after, these Turkish slave soldiers were charging through the streets on the back of horses and knocking over little kids or other people and injuring others. And numerous times, people of Baghdad were trying to attack or at least stop these slave soldiers training or marching through their city. And as we'll see, one solution to that is to essentially create a new city as well, and that would be Samarra. The other thing here, though, is not only is that they're relatively well-trained militarily, but they're awfully expensive, right? So they require not only horses, but backup horses, different people to take care of the horses, and a variety of support people. They're also given a salary. They had fancy clothes. Basically, they were just much more expensive than the average army, remember, the kind of non-professional army at that time was to some degree was paid a stipend, but also more often paid with the proceeds of when they went on raids or attacks, etc. So there's always landed a question of how to pay them. And ultimately, this was a relatively small army of a few thousand soldiers, but also much more effective than the slightly less professional army. And we have to remember the different types of armies that were available, or at least had been used. So in the very early years of the conquests, we had multiple different tribal groups kind of acting semi-independently in a coordinated manner, moving across the Middle East. And they were essentially able to conquer areas, one, because again, they were used to difficult lives, they were mobile, they were trained on moving on camels and to lesser degree horses. And they were very quick and they could attack. And the two major armies that were in that area, the Byzantines and the Sasanians, had basically fought each other almost to the point of death, and therefore could not mount an effective resistance. Afterwards, during the Umayyad reign, the Syrian garrisons became the most important groups of soldiers. They were much more professional. They were ultimately paid more and much more organized, and therefore they had an advantage over other so-called Arab soldier groups in different parts of the Islamic world. And that's why the Syrians became the central army of the Umayyads. For the early Abbasids, they relied instead on soldiers from Khorasan who ended up settling in Baghdad and created, and again, local connections and had local connections within Khorasan. This ultimately was seen to be a liability, and that is why an army based off of slaves was built up. But as I pointed out, they were extremely expensive, and ultimately they were manumitted. They were released from slavery, but they continued to be essentially a client, independent on their former master, in this case, the caliph. So one way of dealing with this question of the resentment that this new army created amongst the population of Baghdad, many of whom were descendants or active members of the Abbasid military, is to create a new capital to house this new group of soldiers. The point of this capital is called Samarra. Today, not much of it remains because it was abandoned after a few decades. But we do see this amazing mud brick minaret and the walls of the fortresses. Now, there's different purposes for Samarra. Samarra is it's not far up. It's about, I think, like 60, 70 miles north of Baghdad. It never really became an organic city in the same way that Baghdad did. Baghdad, if you remember, was essentially a new creation of the Abbasids, built with astrological precision within the first 10 years, and was meant to house both the ruler, the caliph, and his coterie, and then around it, a larger city. But Samarra just never developed in the same way. Part of the reason it was created was also to create real estate possibilities for the new military commanders. So large parcels of land in the city were given to major commanders who then could sell them off or develop them and then rent out the properties. But in this case, the rest of the populace stayed in Baghdad, and basically the caliph was left with his soldiers in this new capital and fort palace. Now, in this situation, as the caliph becomes more and more dependent on these slave soldiers, ultimately this leaves the caliph at the mercy of his soldiers. And in fact, we can see these Turkish soldiers assassinated the caliph al-Mutawakkil in 861. So I think the one after al-Mu'tasim. And this set up quickly a set of dynastic anarchy in Samarra. Um, the slave soldiers, and again, these people are not technically slaves at this point because they've been manumitted, but they're still dependent on the caliph, quickly entered into the process of deciding who the next caliph would be, each faction within them siding with different candidates, etc. And within 9 years, we have a turnover of 4 different caliphs. 2 of those were killed by the troops or in other circumstances. So there was this weird situation in which the soldiers were dependent on the caliph for their livelihood, but at the same time could also overthrow the caliph when necessary. It became clear that this experiment of isolating the caliph in a capital with just these slave soldiers was not going to work. So the caliphs themselves moved back to Baghdad, but the institution of slave soldiers continued to last. One thing to keep in mind, what's the significance here? One is that this is the start of essentially a very professional type of army, one that is, again, separated from the population of Muslims as a whole. So before the armies, whether in the early conquests under the Arab, kind of the Arab tribes, or the Syrian army of the Umayyads, or the Khorasani army of the Abbasids, they were raised from the Muslim subjects themselves. They were paid a stipend or given the booty that came from raiding places. But it was to some degree representative of the Muslim population. And now we no longer have that, right? We have a professional army drawn from non-Muslim slaves who eventually became Muslim, but are in a sense separate from the population at large. Now, is this a problem? Not necessarily. Many people in general were always being ruled by people who did not belong to the same ethnic group or language group as them. I don't think people thought very much of this, but at the very least, it created an institution of military power that continued for quite a while, basically 1,000 years, and was to some degree successful. And in fact, only in 1 or 2 cases did the actual slave soldiers became the sultans themselves. That ultimately, they often meddled within succession struggles, but they didn't directly decide to become sultans. But that happens under the so-called Mamluks between 1200 and 1500 in Egypt. Now, for a lot of scholars in the past 40 years, the question of the role of these slave soldiers in army has been important because people sometimes trace it as an explanation for why the Middle East has a high number of coups, and they're looking for kind of long-term explanations for the power of the army in general. I don't think there's much connection really here, but just beware that a lot of this material on the nature of slave soldiers in the army has those type of questions, and they're in the back of the mind. Until next time, I'll see you.